Hi, welcome to Oaks of Righteousness. This is teaching number 7, which is inappropriate authority. Now, inappropriate authority, the definition is pretty straightforward. An inappropriate authority is someone who has authority over another person and uses that authority inappropriately. That is where the simplistic nature of this situation ends. Inappropriate authority can be very complex and have many different levels. What many even Christians don't realize is that in God's eyes, a person in a place of authority, their responsibility is to give others the correct estimation of God. And it's also, if you are in authority over another person, in God's eyes, your responsibility is to give that person that you're in authority over the correct estimation of themselves. So an inappropriate authority will either give a person that they're in authority over an incorrect estimation of God, or an incorrect estimation of themselves as a person. Inappropriate authority has a very broad spectrum. The severe cases are, a mother that beats her children, or a father who beats his wife and children. That is obviously an extreme example of inappropriate authority. But there's also instances of inappropriate authority that can be very subtle, but over a period of time have a very deep-rooted and long-lasting effect. For example, when I was in college, I worked my way through college working at Walmart. And you got 2 breaks. If you're on an 8-hour shift, you got 2 breaks, and you clocked out for your break. I would go clock out for my break, and then I would go to the bathroom. And this lady who'd been working there for several years, she was older than most of us. One day she told me, "Hey, I noticed that you always clock out for your break and then you go to the bathroom. Don't do that. Go to the bathroom first and then clock out for your break." And, that might seem like a small thing, but I noticed that this person, she was actually teaching younger employees at Walmart how to get an extra 10 minutes break and get paid for it, and to cut all kinds of corners. Basically, how to not give the work that you're being paid for, shaving time off the clock and getting paid for it. Now, again, that's a very, might seem like not a big thing, but that is an example of an inappropriate authority. Here's another subtle example of an inappropriate authority that took place in my life. I participated in athletics in high school and had a certain amount of success. Because of that, I found myself with older guys a lot. When I was a sophomore, my best friend was a senior. And again, it was because of athletics. I was a young sophomore. He was kind of an old senior. So he was almost 3 years older than me. And I didn't realize it at the time, but he was a very, very inappropriate authority in my life because he stepped into the place of an absent father. My father was absent during that time of my life. And this older guy that I really looked up to, I really looked up to him. He stepped into that place of the absent father. And he taught me things that were not according to what God would have had intended for me. For instance, he would tell me things like this. You know, Rupp, you and I will never be good husbands. We both have terrible role models. And he would tell me that over and over and over. After a while, I just started to believe it. It's amazing how later on in my life, I was actually walking those words out. And he would tell me things like this. Another thing that he told me over and over, Rupp, you know, the more money you have, the more attractive you'll be to girls. And I really, really came to believe that. But here's where the inappropriate authority really took a deep root with me and had very, very long-term negative effects. I watched him. His father was very similar to my father, unfaithful to our mothers. Both of our dads were unfaithful to our mothers. And they would go off and do their own thing. My dad would be doing his own thing. My friend's dad would be off doing his own thing. And their wives would just sit at home and wait for them. Just wait for them to come home. It seemed like my mother's life consisted of waiting for Dad to come home. And it was the same with my friend. Well, I watched my dad do this with my mother. And then I watched my friend, who was a senior in high school. He was in a very serious relationship. And I watched he would do the same thing with this girl who truly loved him. Sometimes they'd have plans. Sometimes he'd make her wait for hours before he would go pick her up, and she would wait. But sometimes he would get off doing something else, and he would call her and say, hey, I'll have to change plans. And she would wait for him. And I remember as a young teenager, sophomore in high school, I remember telling myself, someday a woman's going to love me like that, because they waited for them. Now, obviously, that is so far off from what God intends. But this is an example of an inappropriate authority that I didn't know any better. I looked up to him, and it sent me down a path that really, really caused problems, obviously, later on. The crux with inappropriate authority is this. We can learn. No person is born wise. That's the way God has ordained life on earth with human beings. We learn from people who are older and in places of authority. Things that we learn over a period of time, if it's not God's will, if it's not God's intention, at some point, God would have us learn where we've been taught not according to His will, sometimes just plain wrong, just bad. He would have us learn that, and He would have us go to Him and let Him heal us there, and then teach us the correct path. Again, inappropriate authority, sometimes it's very obvious. But many times, and probably more times than not, it's something that can be very subtle that happens over a period of years. But God will have us, He will have us come to the knowledge of it, and He will have us learn from Him, learn His way, get healed, and proceed forward, becoming more and more the image of Christ, which is God's intention for each and every one of us. Your leaders will have some questions, some discussion questions for you. And this is an area where you'll probably have a lot of questions. And they will go over your questions with you. They will have some discussion questions. And hopefully, after tonight, you'll have a grasp of this concept, and you'll have knowledge of what God wants to do with you in this area. My prayer is that God will reveal to you things that possibly have been overlooked, because it's really where God wants to go with us, is things that have been overlooked and maybe not obvious. God bless you and thank you.